to say. So my name's Elliot Caldwell, and I am a native Washingtonian and a 15-year plus veteran of bicycle sort of industry work in the city as a courier and a mechanic. I'm a TWU Local 100 member, and I work for Motivate, which is the company that operates Capital Bikeshare. I'm not here as a representative of Motivate. I'm here as an individual and a union member to help moderate this panel. So I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to thank all the panelists. I'll introduce them in a second, and then they'll obviously introduce themselves and talk a little bit more about their take on some of the important issues we're going to talk about tonight. But I also want to thank our sponsors, 1DC, DC Jobs of Justice, Amalgamated Transit Union Local 689, and I want to thank the Washington Peace Center for the camera and the mic sound system. Unfortunately, one of our panelists could not be here tonight. Dominic, I'm gonna blow his last name, Moulton, from 1DC could not be here. He has to be up in Baltimore dealing with the recent police murder up there. And I think one thing to keep in mind throughout this, as we talk about this topic tonight, is that one of the major issues with bike share, Capital Bikeshare, maybe bikeshare system, other bikeshare systems, is when they're planned, sometimes some of them do very little to engage sort of poor and working class communities of color, and simply holding events and asking people from those communities to take time out of their day to come to an event when they have pressing issues like unemployment and police murder in their neighborhood. There are higher priorities for a lot of those community organizations and for individuals that might otherwise be interested in actually contributing to a discussion around bike share or more broadly maybe transportation equity. So Dominic would have liked to have been here tonight, but I think his spirit or his efforts and his energy were needed in another place, and certainly a place that's very important right now. And that's not to say that there aren't folks in the bike share world who are engaging communities, but certainly there have been problems here with those issues. Briefly, I wanted to just sort of say maybe what brought us together in this room. We're about, I guess, a little over between 4 and 5 years into the Capital Bikeshare system. The first rate hike for Capital Bikeshare is going to take place May 1st. And in December, the workforce voted to join TWU Local 100. So this is sort of a good time to take stock and ask questions about Capital Bikeshare systems more broadly, in looking at sort of challenging issues, sort of big picture issues, not just how many docks should be at a certain station, or things that have come up in previous open house sort of meetings that DDOT or Capital Bikeshare have hosted. While those have been interesting, they haven't necessarily tackled more deeper and more systemic kind of issues. So we may not have all the answers, all of us up here, but I think it's worth asking some tough questions. There is a movement for sort of equity in bike share, led, I always butcher this, but led by the Better Bike Share program, which is sort of led by People for Bikes, the Greater Philadelphia Bicycle Coalition, NACTO, which is the National Association of City Transportation Officials. I always get the NASHTO and NACTO, I always get those mixed up. And the Better Bike Share program really is about increasing access and use in underserved communities, and Katie Monroe from Philadelphia is going to hopefully tell us a little bit more about what they've been doing up there. But I think the Better Bike Share sort of program, it's a number of strategies, it's not just one, and Philly is leading the way and launching this week, so hopefully we can harness some of the energy from Philly and from some of the efforts that coalition groups is doing to bring addressing some equity issues here. So in terms of the format tonight, we're going to have 3 speakers speak first, then maybe take some questions from the audience, and then the last two speakers will go, and then take maybe questions at the end. So just a quick reminder, folks, when we're asking questions to try to, we have limited time in this space to ask succinct questions, and try to sort of, comments are okay, but try to keep them succinct just because of the limited time. And I think with that, we're going to start with our first speaker, who's Kevin Williams from TWU Local 100.
First of all, thank you guys for including me in this discussion, in this forum. I want to thank Ursula for Oh, okay. I want to thank Ursula Farr and Nick for guiding me through this process. I'm not here. I work also for Motivate. I'm not here representing them. In some aspects of the bike share community, I'm a complete novice. I'm into business and operations, and I came into this venture because I needed a part-time job. And before I knew it, I recognized there's some things that are amiss. One of the things that we talk about or we look at is social inequity. I live in Prince George's County. There's very little expansion of bike share in Prince George's County. Prince George's County, Maryland, is the most affluent African American county in the United States, bar none. There are people with money that they blow on silly things. But you don't see the expansion there. Coming from a minority perspective, and I don't plan or profess to speak for all people of color, but there's a resistance because we look at bike share as a little bit elitist. And we don't look at how bike share is a mode of transportation that can change our very lives. Not just in health benefits, but ecological, for emissions and things of that nature. It's been I don't want to say, there hasn't been a concentrated or a great effort for people who understand the nuances of bike share to expand to communities of color, to help us realize the benefits of bike share, of understanding that how we can reduce pollution, how it's a community-oriented event. We see private groups, but we don't see the public aspect of bike share. When you go to cosmopolitan cities, I'm from Chicago, Illinois. Bike share is expanding, but again, where is it expanding? On the north side and the downtown of Chicago. It's not expanding in Inglewood. It's not expanding in Morgan Park. It's not expanding in West Pullman. Again, but for whatever reason, it's keeping out constituents who can help bike share to expand underserved communities. Thanks. One of the topics that we have tonight, and I'm gonna wrap this up real quick, is a question about the private-public ownership of bike share. The model that they're using is an operation maintenance model, where it basically says that the public will own the infrastructure and the private entity will operate or maintain the system. There are great benefits to that, but it's not a good benefit to anyone when there's no transparency to the process. They don't broadcast that bike share is actually owned by the same people they're not serving. I was sharing with Nick in Chicago. People don't understand that Chicago owns that infrastructure. They have them believing that it is a private company owning the infrastructure. If I own the infrastructure, I've got a greater stake in it. I want to see the success. That's something I think that the education piece of all of this needs to be expanded.
Yeah, you're next, Scott. You can introduce yourself.
I'm going to put that there. I have a nice loud voice. Okay, you know? I'm Nick Bedell. I'm the National Bike Share Organizer for TWU. And I just want to look at this, I guess, dovetailing on what Kevin said, to sort of look at it as a comparison between two ideas that are really prominent in thinking about developing cities. One is the idea of a livable city, and one is the idea of an equitable city. And to take the first one, first idea that I think is very much what drives development right now. It's this idea of a livable city. And what is a livable city in this current, model of development? It's dense, it has sophisticated cultural offerings, it has good restaurants with celebrity chefs who build a local artisanal food movement. It has neat, new, architecturally interesting condominium complexes. They have lots of glass and stainless steel and hardwood floors from sustainable forests. Generally, they reclaim waterfronts or downtowns, old industrial areas, and they become like new, cool areas. This is particularly true in New York. They have good schools, or try to have good schools and preschools for young families, so people can raise their families there. There's a push towards publicly available amenities, bike lanes, multimodal convenient transit. There's recycling and composting programs that show that the city is green. Usually there's a major sports team with a publicly funded but privately owned corporate stadium that's named after them, right? City Field and City Bank. And there's a lot of craft beer. So that sort of is the look, and it's the modern sort of development model. And it's often called smart growth, and the nation as a whole is moving into cities and embracing a lot of this stuff. And the question that TWU has been asking is, what is this? How does this lead to an equitable city, and can you have an equitable city in this? So I'm going to talk a little bit about our role in organizing bike share workers and why we took that on in the 4 cities that TWU has currently representing bike share workers. It's New York, it's Boston, it's here in DC, and it's in Kevin's hometown, Chicago. And we took on this labor organizing project largely because bike share workers came to us, not because we particularly sought them out. In New York, the lead organizer called it TWU. There were all kinds of problems, a lot of them born of this public-private, the problems with the public-private relationship that happened. And we started to think about, what is labor organizing? What does it have to do with equity? And for me, right, it always goes back to labor organizing is ultimately a civil rights activity, in my opinion. And you are pushing towards what is, for me, an essential civil right, which is the ability to support yourself and your family in a way that's comfortable. And to do that, you have to have a decent job. So all of these crappy jobs out there that people can't work, can't support their families, have to work split shifts, don't get paid, these jobs create very oppressive and marginalized workers who are trying to access some kind of economic security and can't do it. So what TWU wants out of this is we want to organize this new industry, which is growing throughout the country, and we want to ensure that the folks who work in bike share have the opportunity to participate in the cities where bike share is functioning. And so we want them to be able to enjoy the benefits of the neighborhoods that have stations that they fix. We want them to be able to ride their bikes on the city's new bike paths and walk with their children in the city's new parks and to live and work in the cities that have bike share. And to do that, you really have to have, the sort of 3 basic goals for a unionizing or labor perspective in bike share. The first one is bike share workers have to earn decent salaries that have benefits. You want them to be able to raise a family, stay in the city where they live and work, maybe take a vacation once in a while, and be able to call in sick rather than work because there are no sick day provisions. You want bike share workers to be secure in the knowledge that they're not going to get sick, injured, or killed when they go to work. So they start the day healthy and they end the day healthy. They start their careers healthy and they end their careers healthy. And that lastly, they can retire at the end of their career and have a dignified retirement. And that's the goal of a labor union in this, or our labor union in this effort to organize bike share workers. And, nothing to this. So there's a surprising amount of resistance out there to paying people decent salaries. And what still stuns me after 20 years of labor. I'm like, what are you kidding? You're paying this person $11 an hour. It's just not gonna work. So I want to take a look quickly at sort of where TWU and transit organizing started and think about how far we could actually get in bike share. Bike share is the first new mode of public transportation in the United States of America in 75 years. It is, in my opinion, a public transportation mode and should be thought of as such, even if Motivate clearly says that it's not public transportation and that it is recreational, and that they are uninterested in being integrated into a public transit system. And just as a quick aside, I was traveling through Europe, and if you ride the French subways, you get to ride the French bike share. It's a ticket, which seems to make a lot of sense. So anyway, that helped. 2 minutes. All right. So just a quick comparison. You look at 1935, TWU laid its first stones in transit. And we fought for these 3 ideas. The average New York City transit worker, where the vast majority of our union membership is, earns $65,000 to $70,000 a year, has 4 weeks of vacation, gets a 5th one in the 15 years, 12 sick days, several holidays, defined benefit pension that pays them 2% of the final annual salary for every year that they work. That's what a New York City transit worker gets now. If you imagine that 1935 New York City transit worker, back when it was a privatized system, and it was privately run and employed almost exclusively new white immigrants from Ireland and Italy, and you took their salary in 1935 and you translated it into 2015 dollars. So what were they getting paid then, if they were paid now, if there was no union organizing? It's $460 a week, no pension, no job security, dangerous working conditions, 70 hours a week for $460. And the difference between that and what they have now is the fact that they unionize. And this is the equity piece. So a New York City transit worker, not rich by any means, I'm going to go over 40 seconds, not rich by any means, but has a decent, secure, middle-class job that can raise a family in New York City in the outer boroughs. Can't afford Manhattan, there you go. So that's what we're looking to do. We're looking to organize against the income inequality that exists in the United States of America and exists in our societies by organizing with workers to get decent, well-paying, safe jobs, and hopefully, at the end of the day, bike share workers will be living in livable and equitable cities.
On the dot.
On the dot.
I can do without it.
Chris Townsend with ATU.
Yeah, I'm Chris Townsend from the Amalgamated Transit Union. Thanks for having us and thanks for inviting us. For those that don't know, there's 2 primary transit unions in the country, TWU, which was the CIO upstart, and the ATU, which was sort of the plotting AFL union. And you know, we're probably more similar today than we ever have been, but on the other hand, we both had long histories. And here in Washington, D.C., ATU is the primary transit union by virtue of the fact that the metro system, WMATA, and a lot of the ancillary other spin-off transit groups are represented by us, not all, but many. And that gives us about, depending on how you count it, 14,000 or so working members right here in this region. So thanks for having us, and we applaud the bike workers for organizing and taking this on as something, as Nick points out and the other speakers spoke out. This is something that there's a dire need for it. You can't live on these salaries. But I'm going to mention where we were earlier today because it's really apropos to tonight. But first I want to say that we sit here under a great shadow or a ghost who's smiling down on us. And he's smiling. We're not smiling. He's smiling. His name's Louis Wolfson. And if any of you know the DC transit history, Louis Wolfson, or he got the name Louis the Milker. Wolfson was the guy, look him up, quite a flamboyant character. Not a transit guy. He was a squeeze artist. He was a buyout artist. He was kind of the Gordon Gekko of his day. Anyway, he came into DC in the early 50s and bought Capital Transit and just disassembled it in Milton. And the politicians were either on his payroll or ambivalent about it because who rode public transit? You know, the automobile was picking up steam, so it was poor people, black people, those people that rode the bus. So, you know, there was no great interest in it. But what Wolfson presided over was the complete destruction of the transit system here, so much so that even the U.S. Senate had to investigate it. And he was a flamboyant character. He ran off to California They found him in a hotel under an assumed name, and they had to drag him back to Washington because there had been a strike of Local 689, ATU, during the summer of 1955 over just basic issues, and the system was collapsing. There was enough of an uproar that this set in motion what was about a 10-year decline. Wolfson was eventually expelled from the scene. His pockets were full. He left, went on to practice his craft other places. But that's what was the beginning birthright of Metro, or WMATA, W-M-A-T-A, which everyone now, rides the bus or the subway, however you do it here in D.C. Because there was such a fiasco in this city and in this region that transit stopped. And that, at least in that moment in time, in the early 1960s, some of the forward thinkers, which there are precious few of today, if any, in those councils of government, they understood that we better pull these wreckage pieces together, this mess, and create some kind of a transit system that will work so that this city can function. And had they not done that, you wouldn't have the Washington, D.C. that you have today. But when I say he's smiling down on us, he's smiling down on us from where he sits in the grave someplace where he belongs, because he now sees the politicians and the business community here now disassembling what was put together. And let's not forget this, and bike share workers need to hear this again and again and again, that it's an aberration and an abomination that DDOT has a role in this. That this was supposed to be a Metro and a WMATA board that would jealously protect any public transit instrument in this region and run it as a public utility, so that the public would be considered in this equation, considered in terms of their needs, their rights, what was good for the community, and that would be bus and subway, and now bicycle, streetcar, whatever it would be. Well, of course, if you talk that kind of talk with today's political leaders, this city council or these suburban jurisdictions, my God, they would fall out. Who's that guy? Who's that woman? This would just be considered irrational. But this was, in fact, the guiding principle of what set up Metro. And we probably should take some satisfaction from the fact that we were right, because look at the mess we have around town now. You have all the suburban jurisdictions doing their own thing. Dash over in Alexandria, up in Montgomery County, right on. Everybody pulling the thing apart. Nobody wanted to work with Metro anymore. Metro, it's so perverse now that the Metro board not only no longer wants to run Metro, they're happy to give it away. Until just a few months ago, you had Thomas Downs. Anybody that knew who Thomas Downs was? He was the chairman of Metro here. His day job was for Veolia, the French company that was busy trying to privatize. The corruption is now burst out into the open. It's just not even considered. It's not even considered corrupt to have these kinds of relationships and these kinds of behaviors go on with our public transit system. So we find ourselves tonight here considering the role of the bike share workers and DDOT, which is ultimately the governing body here in large measure. And DDOT is sort of the something that never should have been allowed to develop as it did in transit. But I mean, for those of you that don't know, we're talking about bike share now, the issue tonight, which is owned by the latest company called Motivate, and that will probably change. And we also have a streetcar down 8th Street, streetcar to no place, which is run by a French company, McDonald. And then you have the circulator bus, which the first installment of it is run by First Transit. So you have DDOT essentially now participating in what the suburban jurisdictions are, which is busily undermining and tearing apart Metro, so that we have this situation where they're not doing that just for the hell of it. They're doing it because they know that by doing that, they can undermine the living wage that the Metro workers have, avoid paying the pension that the Metro workers have, and slough off a lousy health care plan, if one at all, onto those members. And it's a cost savings, so they would claim a cost savings to the sponsoring party, whatever the transit mode is. So the last thing I'll say in the shortness of time was we were almost late getting here today because several of us were down at the DDOT budget hearing today. The City Council Transportation Committee was holding the DDOT budget hearing. Let me tell you something. I presume there will be an article in the Washington Post tomorrow. Who knows what the Washington Post will write, but we went there to speak out about the firing of the streetcar workers. Those of you may not know that I know Brother Mice was fired, Farr was fired. Here's a guy that paid dearly for trying to organize, to your credit, brother, to do that. I've been fired. Some of you may have been fired. I mean, this is not the glorious human rights nirvana that the stumbling empire would like you to think it is, as you find out when you try to join a union all too often. But anyway, that said, we've had 8 workers fired, 8 out of about 33 at the streetcar. And we called out Mary Che, the chairman of the committee, and we called out DDOT for this crime. And of course, she acted interested and sort of surprised. And then, of course, the new and supposedly improved, although I don't believe that he is, after seeing his performance today, Brother Brogan, you chime in, and then I'll wind up. What's his name?
Lee Storms Jones.
Lee Norm's Joe, the guy who's now the head of DDOT, we had just explained how 8 people were fired, and he said that there was only a 2 full-time equivalent reduction in staff, and no one questioned him on it. So it's a surreal atmosphere to go down there, and that's what you're dealing with as the bike share, what we're dealing with. It's a surreal atmosphere. It's completely out of control. I don't have any confidence that anyone in that room should have or would have had any confidence that DDOT is anything other than an ethically, financially, mathematically, and politically challenged agency of the first degree. And our work is cut out for us both with the streetcar and with bike share, and thanks for having me.
Cool. So I think we were going to take a break real quick and have some questions from the audience. I wasn't sure if anyone had anything burning from listening to the 3 first folks. Any questions or comments or anything pop into folks' mind?
I mean, this fight over the wage and benefit package of transit workers has been going on for a long time. In 1973, when Metro took over from the private companies, they launched an attack on the transit workers. O'Roy Chalk had sold it to Metro. Metro felt, hey, that last contract we gave these workers, this is too rich. It's got too good of a pension system, too good of a health insurance, too good of a wage package. We're going to take it back. And the response of the workers was, we had a strike in 1974 for 3 days. Then Metro backed off a little bit. We had a 6-day strike in 1978 and shut the city down. You can look at the pictures in the Washington Post. You see traffic on 14th Street Bridge like a parking lot. And after that, Metro backed off for 20 years. They really didn't mess with us very much. And I think that's the lesson. If you can build a movement to actually fight them, then they won't mess with you very much. And to me, a lot of these little companies just don't have the strength in numbers to do that. And that's why, that's why I'm here, and hopefully the rest of the ATU, is that we're willing to use the strength of 689 to help all these other entities, which on their own aren't going to win this fight. But, when the governments think that Metro might get involved, Metro unions might get involved, they have to think, hey, they shut the city down for a day, it's going to cost $150 million. Is it worth saving $1 million on bike share? No, let's just settle this thing. And I think that's the outlook we have to have if we're really going to be successful in this campaign.
I'm not sure. It's an interesting time to live in because you're right. Strikes are absolutely impactful and effective. The delusion that we operate under, I think you used the term stumbling empire, about the DC. Outside of DC, this is a utopia for liberalism. They're not. DC is about money. But at the same time, this is not an atmosphere where I don't think right now, if we had a strike, we would get the impact that we need. Because part of it goes to what Nick is talking about, the utopian society that we live in, where it's this false stainless steel hardwood floors. They can't deal with the reality of it. And we don't have the infrastructure right now. We don't have the leaders. We're trying to grow the leaders to support the movement internally. So I kind of think that if we did that right now, or if we even threaten it, they cut us off before we're full grown. They would flat out chop us off at the knees before we've reached a maturation place where we would be more impactful.
Yeah, I've sort of considered New York City, the original organizing for bike just started in New York. It's a bigger system. There's, 6,000, 7,000 bikes out. There's 350 stations. It's doubling in size. It has 200 plus employees during the high season and 170 or so. Night, it's the only one that's required to have a call center, part of its contract. And we are, we won representation rights September 18th. We've been in bargaining with Mobilization during their taking over of the company. The sort of interesting dynamic is that they can blame everything on them, on the former employer. All did that, that's not our fault. All did that, that's not our fault. And that sort of allows them, frankly, to say we could do something different. So there's some positives to that. But at the end of the day, we're getting down now to about 70%, 65% of the contracts tentatively agreed upon. And we're getting to the point where the rubber's really meeting the road. And that's about wages and benefits and security in the job and your ability to have a stable schedule. And it is, they have a very traditional private sector employer's idea about what that means, which is we pay you more, we put less in our pocket, and we're a profit-making organization. And one of the real problems with the dynamic is that transit, in my opinion, is a public good and shouldn't be run for profit. It's a park, it's a school, it's a shared good of the community and should not be understood as something that generates a profit. And Motivate, which is backed, is a company backed by a hardwood, glass and stainless steel developer, related companies, sees it as an amenity in a city and wants that amenity. It's like, ooh, look, here's a beautiful condo, and there's a bike share, and there's, single origin coffee shop over here. And you can get fresh kombucha. And, that is unfortunate, that view. And I think that the cities have made mistakes in not having their transit systems pick up and run the bike share systems. And then you have sort of the silliness in New York, which is what New Jersey wants. New Jersey City and Hoboken, Fort Lee want bike shares, and they want it connected to the New York City bike share so that you can ride your bike to the station, get on the train, and then ride a New York City bike on the other end. It makes total sense, and if it were intermodal and integrated, the whole thing would make sense. Well, because you have different private companies running everything, of course, we can't get the same charger on our phones. It could have all just been one charger, right? Everybody for everything. That could have happened. So it's just, and the workers are caught in the crossfire. And at the end of the day, from the brother over there from ATU, you're right. At the end of the day, we're not going to get anything unless we exert some kind of power. And the ultimate power the workers have is the ability to withdraw their labor and crash whatever enterprise they're working in, from an auto factory to a McDonald's to a bike share. I hope we get there in New York. I think people are pretty pissed off. So if they don't come with the money, you might be reading about a New York City bike share strike at some point. We'll see.
Can I ask?
Yeah.
So this is kind of a question about the mechanism where DDOT, pays the contractor, and the contractor provides the service. I guess, and you talked about the budget hearing, they're not really interested in the workers. And I don't know, it's unclear, how much is DDOT pushing back on Motivate? Motivate says, this is how much it's gonna cost us, and DDOT's like, or they're like, okay, whatever. Or, how much are they bargaining with the contractor? I guess from my perspective, having negotiated the contract as the person paying the contractor, if we knew that the workers were going to be better paid and have less turnover, we would be willing to pay more to a certain extent. So I don't know if that's your.
Yeah, my comments on it would be this. We should begin to describe things for what they really are and stop living in a juvenile fantasy world which too much of our nation lives in. This contracting setup is a racket. It's a racket. It's nothing more than a racket. We're going to call it a racket because it's a racket. And we saw a racket in operation down there at the city council. How perverse is this? That you have the elected city councilwoman in charge of the transportation for the district beating up on a guy who's another public sector employee at DDOT. None of the private companies are in the room. They're not in the room. They're never in the room. So they're literally banging on this guy about circulator, about bike share, about streetcar, and they're not in the room. So he sits there at his very escalated salary and takes the beating and answers what he can answer, and the city council looks concerned. And of course, I can assure you of what you already know, which is not once did the condition of the workers who do all the work ever come up. It's all about cost, it's all about efficiency, it's all about competitiveness, it's all about the latest lingo du jour. And, that's a pretty grim scenario. But what interrupts their racket is us, as workers and unions. And that's why we just have to keep doing what we're doing. And I don't get out of bed in the morning and revel in the fact that our country is rapidly being turned into one racket or another. But it is. And I don't think anybody's really shocked by that. Go out and talk to people, and people get a sense of great unease that something's not quite right in the whole. Tomorrow in this town, the federal contract workers downtown are going to go on strike, or some hundreds or thousands of them, and I wish them well. They did last year. These are the folks that last year I think was the Smithsonian staff, like the contracted food service and cleaning staff. They just said, to hell with this, and went out on strike. And we're not at that stage yet in some of these particular venues, but we may end up there. And that's ultimately something that you don't take off the table. But really, it was, I just wish that more folks had the time and had the ability to sit in some of these councils and see some of these rackets for what they really are. And it's ominous for the bike share workers because you're the smallest piece of the DDOT racket at this point, followed by streetcar, although the streetcar is an enormous investment. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars and hundreds of millions more that they're contemplating for that thing. And, the circulator bus is going to expand because it also is a reduced wage and no pension. So, our work is cut out for us. But I mean, your confusion, brother, about sort of why it looks like it is, you're nothing confused. You're confused because you recognize it's not legitimate. You're stopping because you're saying, well, that doesn't look legit. It's not legit. Where I come from, rackets are not legit. Rackets get investigated and maybe prosecuted once in a while. So, that's strong stuff, I realize. But I think that it serves us well to remind you that there's nothing wrong with you. There's something wrong with the way they run things. So.
All right, I think we were going to go with our next couple speakers. The next one, do you want the mic?
Can you guys hear me? I don't
Yes.
know if I need the mic.
Well, I'll introduce anyway. It's Katie Monroe. She's the Better Bike Share Outreach Manager with the Bicycle Coalition of Greater Philadelphia. She's came down from Philly, so give her your undivided attention.
This is fascinating. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. We're launching our bike share this week in Philadelphia on Thursday, so it's a really big moment for us, and it's also a really important moment for us to be looking to what's happening in other cities, especially the city in the U.S. that's kind of had the big city that's had bike share the longest, and to see how these things have played out. So I originally was going to come to this meeting to just observe and listen because I'm very fascinated by these questions, and I think it's really important. I appreciate the opportunity to speak a little bit, but I'm going to keep it brief because I think this is a local conversation, and I'm more here to listen. But as Elliot said, I am a part of an initiative called the Better Bike Share Partnership, which is very much about thinking critically about how bike share can be better, obviously, from the name. It is, I think sometimes language is really important. You call it a Better Bike Share Program. We actually thought very intentionally about calling it the Better Bike Share Partnership, and everything that we're doing is really the goal is to be in partnership with local communities and different community groups and be really coming from a place of listening. But just big picture, this is a large family foundation funded grant, basically, that is focused on Philly but also has a national level component to it. The recipients are two national organizations, the People for Bikes and the National Association of City Transportation Officials, and then the City of Philadelphia and the Bike Advocacy Organization in Philly, which is where I work, the Bicycle Coalition of Greater Philadelphia, so Philly's WABA, basically. And so, unlike in a lot of cities where I think that the Bike Advocacy Organization plays mostly a cheerleader role, and certainly we're definitely cheerleaders as well for the bike share in Philly, but we really wanted to engage a little deeper than that, and we were really happy to have the funding, frankly, to be able to do that, because it wasn't going to happen otherwise. And so I just want to share a little bit. My role is to manage the outreach program and the community engagement piece of that. Some of the money that went to Philadelphia for this effort paid for stations in underserved communities that wouldn't have been there otherwise. But it's absolutely not serving all of Philadelphia. I don't want to get too into the geography because you guys live in DC. So has anyone spent time in Philadelphia? So basically, the bike share stations quickly are in Point Breeze, the bike share stations that are being cultivated by this particular effort are in Point Breeze, metropolitan area, and sort of lower North Philly, mostly east of Broad, so not the Strawberry Mansion stuff west of Broad, but the neighborhoods east of Broad up to about where Temple is. So obviously these are all the certainly communities that face high rates of poverty, but also communities that are close in to Center City and therefore are definitely experiencing a lot of changes and gentrification, and that those are questions that are, you know, at the forefront. And so those are the communities that my team has been engaging in advance of getting the bike share about bike share, which I think is a really important piece that, you know, this conversation hasn't been at a point where cities have really thought before they installed things about talking to people as much. And the process that we've gone through is by no means perfect. We've made mistakes along the way, and we're happy to share them. But the idea was lots of public meetings and also more creative ways of engaging folks ahead of time to really just, you know, I think that the neighborhoods that were going to be served were already kind of like decided at the beginning, like there was a limit to how much public input went into that, but the micro level station siting questions is, should it go in this neighborhood or this other part of this neighborhood, this corner, is this a good corner, is this a bad corner? Those are the types of questions that my team has been working to engage people on in advance, and then post-launch and for the next couple of years really, we have the role of going to existing community events to talk to people about bike share, leading community rides in partnership with local organizations and local groups, and also, you know, doing bike share engagement, but also listening to what communities want that to look like, and figuring out what that looks like. One piece that I am really proud of that I want to share specifically about the outreach work that we're doing is that this question that Elliot brought up, the person whose spot I replaced, who's dealing with, you know, this prioritization of community issues is something I think about all the time. It's like, why should someone talk to me about bike share when they're worried about, you know, whether their kid is going to get shot? Like, obviously, I can see where the priority would lie there. I don't presume to be more important than that. But where was I going with that? What was I just saying? I just got really upset thinking about it.
Something you were proud of that you were doing.
Oh, yes, thank you.
You're welcome.
So one of the tenets of our programming that we're going to see how well it works, and thank you, and tweak it next year as needed, or even as we go through this year, is a Bike Share Ambassador program where we are paying community members to be ambassadors for Bike Share. We thought it was really important not to just expect people to donate their time to a new thing that hasn't necessarily proven itself yet in their eyes. So it's a two-tiered ambassador program. We hired a street team of part-time, hourly folks who are like bike ambassadors. I think Waba has ambassadors of that type. This is a pretty standard model where we need people to go out and support the events and the classes and the tabling events and stuff like that we want to do. So that's we have 5 members of the street team, and then we're halfway through. We've hired 10 out of 20 community leader ambassadors, which are usually folks who already have a job, or this isn't their primary job at all, and it's a $1,000 stipend for the summer to help connect us with what's going on in the community. We're still kind of figuring out exactly what it looks like. Frankly, I think it'll look really different depending on the person and depending on their strengths and what we brought them into the loop for. But that's something that I think is really important, and something that we're working on is creative ways to compensate people for engaging in these questions and helping us get the word out about bike share. So that's a little bit of an overview. I can't speak to as much of the labor stuff. I think that from my perspective, our operator, the private company that's contracted with the Mayor's Office of Transportation and Utilities in Philadelphia, is a very small new company, but it's all folks who came from Alta, basically. So, down the line, who knows what this company will be.
Who left Alta?
Yes, very much left Alta. So our focus has been on basically closely monitoring who they're hiring and what sort of hiring partnerships are set up with local, workforce development organizations and stuff. But I can't speak to as much. Certainly, we're not at the point where people are organizing, but who knows down the line. But it is a small, locally owned company that we have a little bit more oversight of potentially. So it is a little bit different of a situation there. that's me for now. I'm happy to continue talking more about Philly, but I also am really happy to hear more about DC, so thank you.
Cool, thank you, Katie. Next up is Carol Tyson, who's a, I guess, local transportation equity advocate and an old dear friend. Do you want the mic or no? Oh, cool.
Hello. So I'm going to try to breeze through this. So I currently work for, I'm a director of disability policy at a place called the United Spinal Association. We're a disability rights organization, but I am not here representing them. I'm here representing myself. But in my day job, I have fallen into this world of transportation equity, and I absolutely love it because there's all this cross-sectioning of worlds that I've been involved in the past. But I do a lot of work in the Transportation Equity Caucus, which is a national coalition of many different groups looking at transportation equity for low-income communities, people of color, women, people with disabilities, and thinking about how is transit benefiting everybody, how are people accessing the jobs and good quality jobs, and how is transit getting people to all the different places they need to go. So that's what I think about during the day. So I'm just going to add a bit about disability, accessibility, and one of my least and most favorite topics, Uber. And then I'll leave it to you. Disability cuts across race and class. So all of this discussion is important for the folks that I represent and for me as a person with a disability. Roughly 20% of the district's residents have a disability. More than 20,000 people in DC between 18 to 64, so it's not just seniors, have an ambulatory disability. 2.1 million visitors come to DC with a disability. Adults with disability are more than twice as likely to lack access to adequate transportation. Across the board, about 500,000 people the last time there was a study are homebound because they can't get out of their homes. There's no transportation. Physical barriers can make transportation impossible. Everything we have for in the disability community and for transportation, we've had to fight for really hard. But income may actually be the greatest barrier to transportation. And there's not as much data as I'd like, but that's what I think is true and what I've seen. In 2012, only 33% of the working age people with disabilities in DC were employed. Nearly 30% of people with disability in DC live in poverty. So when we're talking about poverty and affordability issues, that directly impacts the disability community. And for workforce, just 3.8% of the transportation and utilities industry, sorry, I said that backwards. People with disabilities have just 3.8% of the jobs in the transportation and utilities. So that's just some context. So obviously, affordability, it's probably not affordable for many people with disabilities, bike share, whatever the cost is. And bike share, at least in DC, is going to be physically inaccessible to many people with a physical disability. And I think there are ways to make it accessible for many folks. Not everybody with a mobility impairment uses a wheelchair. So if a trike would be a great option, but I think generally the solution is to ask the people with the disabilities themselves what would be a solution and what could work for them. So I know that they tried it in Madison, and I don't know if they're still using the trikes there with their bike share program. So there were some questions that were asked of the panelists. I wanted to address a few of them. What differences have I noticed between publicly operated transit systems and private here for low-income, underserved areas, accessibility, and a few other things? So I can think, or I was thinking a little bit about the difference between WMATA and the circulator, because that's DDOT and it's a public-private partnership. In the disability community, there is a big difference, and actually until today, one of the big differences that was really pissing me off was they're both required to be accessible because they receive public funding, wheelchair accessible, I mean, and to have a whole list of other accessibility requirements under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But if you go to the WMATA site, there's all sorts of messaging all over the place on the website about accessibility and just language for the disability community about how can you use our service. And up until today, if you went to the Circulator website, you had to look and look and look, and it was a tiny little one sentence and a fact buried. Today, they improved that. And so it was going to be this strong talking point that I had, but then they fixed it. But there's a accessibility committee and a bunch of other public committees for WMATA as a way to talk about how to improve things and to complain, but there is not any of that for DDOT right now, and for the Circulator and for the streetcar, and definitely I think probably not for Bikeshare. Though I know less about Bikeshare, I know more from friends that work there, but because I can't use it as a person with a disability. So. Okay, so on to Uber. The new HR director, apparently, Motivated, has said they'd like Bikeshare to be more like Uber. Is this problematic? I cannot say more than, oh my God, yes. Okay, here are the few reasons I came up with. Uber, I know way too much. They are very lightly regulated. There was a story, Martin DeCaro did a story this week that said the DC region is the friendliest probably on the planet, honestly, for Uber and their other companies, the transportation network companies. So the bill, I was involved and tried to get some accessibility language in there. It was absolutely a horrific and disgusting experience. They do everything they can to not provide data. It's the big sticking point. It's a huge fight. They don't want to tell you how many drivers they have. They don't want to tell you what kind of cars they don't have. They don't want to tell you how many wheelchair accessible vehicles they have, and the answer is none. Or what neighborhoods they drive to. None of that. They are not willing to share it, and they fight tooth and nail every single city on the planet. Basically, it's a huge issue. The effects of their service are often not considered in transportation planning, so traffic, congestion, let's see, fewer people. They are some good people in San Francisco who do look at this stuff. So less transit ridership, so less safe. And then in San Francisco, because of Uber, we have 20 fewer accessible taxis now, just in 1 year, than we did in the first year.
And terrible working conditions.
Yeah, and terrible working conditions. So and that was my next point. They insist that they are not a transportation provider. Instead, they're a technology app. They employ independent contractors. That's a huge red flag for me. I worked for unions for a long time. Allows them to, on the surface, skate past labor laws and ADA requirements. They're in the courts right now. There are several disability. Sorry, I'm not looking to see if you're holding up a sign. Okay. Many lawsuits. They keep passing up passengers who are blind, and in one instance shoved a service dog in a trunk. So they're not providing safe service, they're not providing accessible service, and they deny any responsibility to do so. So yes, just thinking about two real quick things. Prioritization. I've had folks in the disability community who had an accessibility forum last year, partly so I could talk about Uber. People are like, why are you talking about this so much? Let's fix the problems that we have with paratransit and with WMATA and everywhere else. And I was like, well, you're not going to have paratransit or WMATA if this keeps going in this direction. We're going to lose everything we fought for. And all these new companies that are coming down the line, they don't care about us. And neither does the city council. So we have to start fighting now. So the very last thing I would say, because I was asked to think about what would a more equitable bike share look like, I would say, sort of based on what it sounds like you guys are doing, really reaching out to the community and asking what people want, including the disability and senior community, because I think there are solutions to make bikes accessible. And of course, ensure workers are paid their fair wages and receive good benefits. But I think a big point, and I'm really glad I came and learned a lot more here tonight, is that they need to be considered a part of the transit system. They really do. And I know that they're DDOT, I don't know if it's already happened, but there's the possibility they're going to have a council that's looking at routes and fares for a streetcar and circulator. And I asked, well, why wouldn't you include the bike share in that? Because that's fares and locations. And I think other people should ask that same question. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol. Appreciate it. So we're going to take our sort of second round of questions or thoughts if there's other folks that have questions specifically for Katie and Carol. And Katie's down from Philly, so she's not going to be here next week. She's going to be busy launching their system. So if you have something for her,
Wants my card, I'm happy to card.
but in person, I'm saying it's like it's nice to talk to someone in person, not just over the internet. Any thoughts, questions? Anyone have anything that sprung to mind?
I have a quick question.
Jason.
So in Philly, just basic logistical thing, do you know what the term of length of the contract is for the initial bike share contract with the Mayor's Office of Transportation?
I actually was just talking about this the other day. I think it's 5 years.
Okay,
but I'm
cool.
Not 100% sure.
So
Don't quote me on that.
I think
That's
that's
something I should really know.
I think that's the same that it was in DC initially
Yeah.
in 2010. I'm just curious. Okay.
Other questions in the back? Or Christy, hey, sorry.
Katie, can you talk a little bit about the unique pricing of the memberships for the bike share in Philly?
Absolutely. This is thinking about your fare increases. It's still the same structure that it was before, and Philly has really departed from the norm of what bike share fare structures normally look like. And I think there's some good things and some bad things about that. It was definitely done very intentionally. I want to preface what I will say about our fare system by saying that I don't speak for the city of Philadelphia, so I was sort of at the table for some of these conversations, but I can't say this is why they did it this way. I can say why I think they did it this way, and I can say what I think is good and bad about it, but I can't speak on behalf of Philadelphia. This conversation is something that I'm doing a lot in my job lately. I realize it's very interesting to sort of be positioned between advocate for the people and what they say, and representative of the city. That's something I've been navigating a lot in this particular role. So I've practiced that speech. But basically, we don't have an annual membership. We're one of the only systems that doesn't have an annual membership in the U.S. The reason for that, I believe, is sort of twofold, both because the annual membership as it currently exists in most cities is kind of not expensive enough, and also too expensive at the same time. It's too expensive of an upfront cost for a lot of people, and it as sort of the default, this idea that you would buy your transit automatically on an annual basis is not how most people think about purchasing their transit in general. Maybe once in a while there's a system where you might buy an annual pass, but for that being the default, it ends up being a large amount of money for someone to commit to upfront, especially with a new system that they're not really sure about. So lowering that upfront cost is one of the reasons that our default is a 30-day membership and not an annual membership. But also, quite frankly, bringing in more money overall, because I think there's a growing consensus that the annual membership is kind of too good a deal. The people who are using the system the most are paying into it the least. So that's part of the idea too, is that, and we can argue about what that number should be, but that's sort of the general idea. So our membership will be $15 for 30 days, which ends up being more than even the new higher annual membership for Capital Bikeshare, but is obviously a much lower upfront cost. So that's one thing that's different. The other thing that's really different is that so for that 30 days, you get unlimited rides up to an hour. So it's an hour instead of 30 minutes. And that's something that really came out of talking to community members, holding focus, both sort of research-based focus groups and also informal community outreach. There's a wide perception that half an hour wasn't long enough. And at the end of the day, it could be that not that someone might actually take a trip that's longer than half an hour, but that's a perceived barrier of thinking that it's going to take longer than half an hour, and therefore I'm not going to use it if I only have half an hour. So we'll see how it plays out, but it's an hour that you get on the bike for each trip before you get charged additional. So that's the Indigo 30. It's sponsored by Independence Blue Cross, so it's called Indigo. And then, so if you don't get that monthly pass, there's two other options. One is Indigo Flex, which is $10 upfront cost to get the key, and then it's $4 for each time you check out the bike, and you have it for up to an hour each time. So that's really only economical if you're going to use it less than 4 times a month, or if you're visiting Philly, regularly, but not often enough that you'd want to pay $15 every month. And then the sort of base fare is actually not a per day or weekend or whatever the standard model is. It's a per trip cost, which the intention behind that is to sort of bring it more in line with, we have SEPTA with public transportation and how people pay for public transportation, but the cost is much higher than a single trip on public transit in Philadelphia. They're about to increase the transit fare from $225 to $250. The cost for half an hour on an Indigo bike, if you just walk up to the station and don't have a membership, is $4 for half an hour. So it's much more. And you can get tourists to pay that, and I think that's the idea behind it, is to recoup, get more money out of the tourists that come visit. So from my perspective, in doing community outreach, I am promoting the Indigo 30 membership, pretty much. That's what, that's the one that's a good deal, and that's what I'm promoting to people. I think that's the membership that is a good deal to residents of Philadelphia, and the other ones aren't as much. That's not what Independence Blue Cross would probably want me to frame it as. But the other piece that we are doing that's gotten a lot of, probably more attention than it deserves, is that's not fair, but has gotten a lot of attention, is we do have a cash membership program, the first bike share to launch with like a full across the board option. So the Indigo 30, $15 a month option, you can go on the website, sign up, and then instead of going through the credit card process, you can click, I want to pay with cash. There's a company called Pay Near Me that we're working with that will text you either a code if you just have a regular phone, or a barcode if you have a smartphone. You take that code or barcode to any 7-Eleven or Family Dollar, pay in cash there, it immediately computes with the system, and they send you your key just as if you had. It is obviously one more step, but that's how that works. I'm happy to go into more detail about how that works. I don't think it's the magic key to bike share equity is making a cash membership. I think it's one important step among many. But those are some things about how our payment and fare structure is different. We'll see how it goes. It's an experiment.
I just want to say one thing. I was in contract negotiations with Motivate, and they said their ideal customer is a customer that you would find in a fitness club who pays a monthly fee and never goes. And that's what they want.
So you're saying from the monthly?
They like the monthly. They want to make the monthly fee, the yearly membership. They want yearly members that don't pay, that don't ride.
Right.
And what they have is yearly members who ride all the time, and it's killing them.
Yeah.
So in New York City, they raised the yearly enormously.
Right.
But still, what they're really looking for is how to get money with people not riding.
I mean, it's a built-in flaw in the whole structure, right? Is that the system does not get more money out of people who have paid. I mean, it's one of the reasons for going towards a more per-trip cost, because to the people running the system and recouping the fares, there's no incentive for people to actually ride the bikes. It's like a built-in problem with the whole system. But, I think that...
What is the rate of recovery in terms of fares versus actual cost of operations?
For Capital Bikeshare, we don't know yet in Philly. I don't know what they're projecting. I don't think they have a lot of data to go on because it's such a different model.
I mean, I think if you had the folks from DDOT, they may have more of that information. But like the program manager may have that information more than I as a worker would. But yeah, it is the highest of all the transit in the area.
And Motivate will tell you that of the 9 systems that they run, DC is the most profitable.
And just so folks, because I don't want to assume that folks know more about sort of Capital Bikeshare and the operations and changes, but the only part of the system that can be cash in DC is in Arlington County, not in DC, Montgomery County, or Alexandria, as far as I know, in terms of cash memberships. And I don't know, I'm not exactly sure how used that program is. It exists. How much it's used, I'm not 100% sure.
It's really new.
And it's really, yeah, it just started relatively recently. They've been talking about it in DC for a very long time, and I think there's going to be a push for it, but I think it's still down the pipeline. In terms of the fare hike that's going to be taking place May 1st, I think it's around 12 to 15% kind of across the board for both 1 day, 3 day, month, and yearly membership. So it's again, maybe a few months ago, Capital Bikeshare did had a big sort of town hall meeting or open house meeting about the fare hike and explained it into detail. But it's pretty much across the board, and it's still the before overage, the ride is still 30 minutes. Again, I think there have been discussions of that going up to 45, but it's still a 30 minutes. A 30-minute window, and that's, again, primarily to take advantage of the fact that a lot of the revenue that's generated is from the tourists, and oftentimes tourists don't necessarily know where stations are, don't necessarily know how to access the part where it tells you where the docks are. If there's docks full at one place, they don't necessarily know where they're going to dock somewhere else. So
I got lost on the way here and probably went over 30 minutes on my Capital Bikeshare.
Right. So the overage fees is where a lot of that money comes from, or a lot of the profit comes from in terms of especially the 1 day and 3 day memberships. From what I know, but again, I'm servicing the bikes. I'm not on the inside. I'm looking at the actual figures. So, other thoughts or other questions?
I have a question for Carol. So we were talking about Uber, like in San Francisco, they did the study that 2080 accessible taxis were removed from the scene because Uber started, I guess, providing paratransit services. How is that legal at all? Because from my impression, Uber is just, you're on a Civic.
So there's actually the requirements for accessible taxis they're not very stringent. They're not very strong under the ADA. That's why it's been such a long and hard push, and why it's so exciting that 20 are now gone in San Francisco. So they're I'm not going to get into all of it, but basically the drivers, it's not a city-run program. Like the drivers have something called a medallion. That's how they run in San Francisco, like they do in New York. And the drivers turned in their medallions and said, "I can't do this anymore. I'm not, making enough money." And so potentially they went and drove for Uber. I don't know. That's definitely happening here amongst our taxi drivers. And so that's how.
So just to clarify, because I think your question is really interesting, so you're saying that the 20 accessible taxis went away because Uber essentially put them out of business, not that Uber replaced by providing any type of accessible service?
Oh, no, they don't, not in San Francisco.
Correct.
No.
So I guess my question is how is Uber providing this, supplementary paratransit?
They're not providing accessible service in San Francisco or DC at all. No wheelchair accessible service. They're providing, get into all of this, but they're providing wheelchair accessible service, I've heard, and they have told me, in Chicago and Houston, and maybe one other place, maybe San Diego. And for the most part, what they're doing is using accessible taxis. And that's very upsetting. So that's what they're doing there. And I don't know what the wages are like. They're probably not very good. They're only, the one actual good requirement under the ADA is that drivers and folks that work for a transportation company have to be trained on how to provide good service and how, on disability etiquette and how to talk to people and with a wide range of disabilities. And so taxi companies have to do that, and they know it, even though they might not do it. But Uber, because they say that they are not providing transportation and it's not a public, it's not a public accommodation, they're saying, no, we don't have to do that. And when we've had discussions with them, which we have had many, they said, well, we'll train some of our drivers, and they call it Uber Assist. And it's like, you're supposed to be very grateful that they train some of their drivers, and you can call those people and have them come and get you. So, and that's just in those cities where they have the accessible service. So, thank you for asking that.
Question for the whole panel on bike share. A couple of things. One, and I might have missed this because I wasn't here at the very beginning, but the discussion of recreation versus transit and bike share is an interesting one. Chris and I were talking about this earlier, that one of Motivate's underlying ideas for bike share is that it's recreational and not transit. And so I'm curious as to if that's a trend, if that's just a weird Motivate thing, or if there's an industry-wide sense here and in Canada or in any other systems where people are looking at it and trying to reframe it as something else, because it gets them out of a hell of a lot of requirements and regulation if it just becomes a nice thing for tourists to go on a ride around the Capitol. The second thing, and related to that, when we were at the DDOT hearing today, they mentioned what the DDOT director described as a big drop-off in ridership. And I don't know if that's true or not, and he didn't really seem to know much at all about anything that he was talking about, but on that issue particularly, he seemed to suggest there's a big drop-off in ridership, and that Mary Che was asking him why. Like, she was very surprised to hear this and was asking, she said, I'm an annual member, I don't ride, but I'm an annual member. So she said, I'm very surprised to hear that. And he said, well, a lot of people are starting to buy their own bikes. So I'm just curious about the two things. Do we actually, as workers or as people who represent workers, do we actually feel like there's less rotation of bikes? Is there less maintenance going on? So is that true at all? And if so, is this recreation thing a way for them to try to save their business, or is it just that they're reframing it for some other nefarious purpose?
We just broke a record for Cherry Blossom by 3,000 to 4,000 rides. So it's absolutely wrong. Eric Gillen, our general manager, just announced it. I think it was 35,000 rides over the Cherry Blossom Festival. So no, have no idea why.
I mean,
Yeah.
Okay. You should have him talk to his.
You would think he would. Yeah, they're actually about to set up mobile corrals. The ridership is up there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they're waiting on the permits right now. So, I don't know, I guess.
You can see it on the street.
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious that ridership's
see it
still
everywhere.
very high.
Yeah,
That's my impression, yeah.
I mean, it dips seasonally, obviously, but I think it's coming right back up.
I know in the Twin Cities they take theirs off the roads for part of the winter and
Yeah,
stuff like that.
Boston, too.
But it's everywhere I go. It seems like it's increasingly popular, and it's because it's a thing that you can do in different cities now. People are becoming more accustomed to it as an option. I ride city bike when I go to New York. When I moved here at first, I was riding bike share all the time. So,
And I think one of the indicators of that, I mean, bike share is popular, and I think that's it's popular both for residents and in New York City particularly, people live in very small apartments. Bike is a burden. I have my daughter's friend rides the city bike to and from school every day because it doesn't make sense to keep his bike in his apartment. It's kind of a good solution that way, and so it's very, very popular. But every one of Motivate's cities is expanding, every single one.
so what is this recreation
So
focus that they
I
have?
think the recreation is what you think it is. It's a way to get out of integration with the existing public transit system. Privately run, publicly accessed transit is like a long time thing. Right? New York City subways were privately owned, and it ultimately fails. And I honestly believe that if we're back in this room in 15 or 20 years, hopefully the public entities will have bought and taken over and are running bike share. Because if it's going to be a profit-making business that some large company like Mobilization can really make a lot of money, they're going to have to grind the workers down in order to keep their margins high. And then they're going to see their equipment, deteriorate, and lots of bad things are going to happen. Right now, they're on a high. They got lots of money to spend. They got lots of sponsorship. I mean, Citibank got the best deal in advertising ever. Right? They got 6,000 neon blue monstrosities in the middle of New York City streets. Right? And that is driving the profitability of it, not the fare box.
Can I say one quick thing about the recreation question? I think it's super fascinating, and I'm really, these like the perspective of it's a way to get out of, regulation is very familiar and very on board with that perspective. And I also think that there's a lot of great things about framing bike share as transportation, period. However, in some of the a lot of the community outreach I've done, I think that when you go too far is when you equate recreation with tourists. There are people in neighborhoods who need physical activity, who want access to green spaces, who want to be using the bikes and don't necessarily want them to commute to their job that is in Northeast Philly that's way too far to get to on a bike share, even if there were a station there. So I think that we need to be careful about the way that we are framing bike share as transportation, because I think that sometimes there are people in communities that want to use the bikes, especially if we have this hour time limit instead of 30 minutes. Like, riding around in their neighborhood for fun is a reasonable use of the bike share. I'm not going to tell someone that that's the wrong way to use bike share because you're not going from point A to point B. You know, bringing it back to the same station is allowed. You know, so I think that we want to be careful when we navigate this question of like transportation, point A to point B, because recreation doesn't necessarily have to mean tourists. It can be people living in cities as well.
One of the thoughts on that question of what does equity look like for bike share, one of the things that I think is lost right now in how bike share is structured is that lots of people shop in those big cargo bikes. You've seen that, right? And I actually would like one of those, but I am never putting that thing in my house, right? Because it's too enormous. But if racks had multiple kinds of bikes on them, which is an idea that's been brought, so if in a residential neighborhood you could pick up a cargo bike, go to the grocery store, buy it, and put it back in the rack. I think that's another way that we could see bike share being integrated into people's, and not necessarily for transit as a commute to work.
Carol talked a little bit about how kind of the privatized transportation systems are impacting the disability community. Could any of the rest of you, and I know this was probably what Dominic from 1DC was supposed to talk about, but could any of you talk about kind of how the bike share expansion and the general trends in terms of privatization of transportation is impacting other kind of marginalized communities and these trends of gentrification and displacement that we're definitely seeing in New York and DC and Philly and all these places that kind of goes along with the livable city image that you put out?
Want that one?
I think a lot of it has to do with the housing patterns. And you see that the developers and these nouveau transit companies all go hand in hand, and it's not always nefarious, but it frequently becomes nefarious because it becomes a chase after an income, disposable income, or a particular transient type thing, and always connected to higher rents and condo and gentrification and whatnot. So, you know, it's very upsetting. Maybe it's not the cause of the trend, but it's one of the symptoms of it. But I know we see it here, you know, those you all live here in DC, I presume, so you see it here. It's kind of a scramble. The neighborhood that you moved into 10 or 20 years ago because it was close to the bus and the metro, you can't afford to live there anymore, and you got to go out to the suburbs. And the suburbs are where Metro has willingly thrown back to these private companies the transit system, so your bus goes from every 15 minutes to every 2 hours or something. So your life gets kicked around because this, you know, it doesn't make sense. And I guess that's the, you know, it comes back to the question that Todd asked about, as I've pondered this question about whether it's bike as transit or bike as recreation. To me, I always think the employers, the private companies that are looking at this from the Motivate standpoint, from the McDonald's standpoint, from the First Transit standpoint, MV, Veolia, Transdev, the rest of them, they don't want to go near transit in the sense that then they might feel an obligation to provide it to somebody that they don't want to provide it to. And recreation sounds better to them because it's more, we'll let you have it if you can pay for it, kind of a thing. And I don't know, I mean, the disabled community is really SOL on this question, sadly. And that's what we have to fight to defend on. I mean, it's partly the May 1st flyer, that if you pick one up in the back, Arab Union ATU's having an event on May 1st over at Metro headquarters, and it's a little clumsy on our part, it's a little awkward, but we're getting out of our shell to go talk to folks that we take around on Metro Access and to try to, for the first time, build a serious linkage with the folks who need to ride that, because that will go down the drain, either due to neglect by the Metro board or the private companies that are currently running into the ground, or the Ubers that are erupting and really looking at it from a profit standpoint. So, I mean, I applaud all of you. I mean, just keep putting people back in transit, and you know, that's the primary place that you should begin, but that's kind of going out of style here in the country these days. Everything is money, 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 efficiency and competitiveness and all that stuff.
Other thoughts from folks on the panel about that question? Sorry.
Well, I'll take the privatization question a little. I mean, I just think privatization of the public sector is just a horrible trend that is, waxes and wanes, I think, in the United States. We're on a particular hot streak of private. You want to privatize education. You look at, New Orleans after Katrina had, pre-Katrina had 35 public schools and now has none. And there's a tremendous amount of money that can be scooped by private sector companies when they invade the markets that the public sector is serving. And transportation is one of those. And if you come in, Veolia took over a publicly run bus company in Long Island 2 years ago, and they cut the service, they cut the wages, they cut everything. Buses are going down the toilet. They're scraping as much money as they can, and then they're dropping the contract, and they're out. And it's the. I think one of the things that's really insidious about it all is that, like, this Uber method and ride share is another one that's coming out. It's going to be an intermodal app that'll let you plan your trip based on a variety of transit options, and the whole, and even Airbnb, which is threatening the hotel industry. All of these efficiencies that you get through the sharing economy, workers and the people that are being served are invisible in the process. And if you privatize that all, then the needs of disabled population, of less affluent populations, are going to be pushed to the side, and that's what's happening.
I think it's a couple of things that we're facing. An era of revisionist historians. Generation X, we got people who have absolutely forgotten that unions, organized labor, is what caused the country to grow. We've got a whole movement dedicated to the entrepreneurial spirit of America that's false. Because you can't be entrepreneurs if you don't have a solid infrastructure, and that was built on the back of organized labor that allowed that to take part. But we've got all these people who are looking for the next savant to come from Silicon Valley or Wall Street, and they're forgetting what got us to this point is the middle class, organized labor, decent wages, and that fight. And sometimes I just wonder, because we see the hipsters and the people my age or younger riding the bikes, and they're forgetting, how did you get to this place? It was on the backs of others. And that's one of the big crimes. Uber is false. The rest of that stuff, it just kind of perplexes me how we've got this generational malaise about how do we reach this place in history.
I think I'm still confused about something, and I have a question. I was at a bike equity meeting for Bikeshare last month, and one of the things that came up was that they considered it to be public transportation, but I'm hearing here that Motivate does not.
They don't.
So there's a disconnect between DDOT and Motivate, or is DDOT lying, or what? Is something that's off there?
Motivate has said in contract negotiations with the union, and in many, many of the town hall meetings that they hold with their employees, that they are not running public transportation. And they're clear on that. And then the various cities, right, because we organize Boston, Chicago, New York, DC, the city might say, this is a new mode of transportation. As Mayor de Blasio in New York City says, City Bike is the next new thing. But the company itself, we ain't doing no public transportation.
Okay. And I have a quick question for Kevin. I came in just on the tail end when you were speaking. I live in, I have a house in Prince George's County, and I don't ride much there, because there aren't any bike roads, there aren't any bike lanes there really, and it's sort of just scary. But I did hear you saying that there aren't any bike shares there, which I had not realized until I was looking for one the other day, and I thought there's no bike shares in PG County. Is there a plan to?
None.
None. There's no plan to put any in Prince George's.
Because they're not. Part of it is the company. Part of it is the infrastructure of the county.
Okay.
They're not realizing, as you talked about expanding the base, when you talk about how in Philadelphia, or people should not just look at it as transportation for exercise, they're not even looking, they're not forward thinking about what this can do for the community. It's an obvious one. If they had one from Naylor Road or Branch Avenue
Right, you go right to the city.
to National Harbor,
Yeah.
you're expanding National Harbor, but you don't have things to get people there.
Right.
You don't even have town halls or the conversation. It's not taking place. And there's no, to be honest with you, there's very little grassroots movement to get them to put it on the agenda for even the next fiscal year.
Not even at University of Maryland?
That's actually, I think, the one place apparently where there has been some movement, but it's the town of College Park that I think is pushing.
Yeah, it's
Not necessarily the county government, but it's the town government. That's what I've heard, but that's just, I think that's sort of the ether. That's nothing I have like a direct line on.
That makes me sad. Well, thank you.
There was one thing that I was, as more as a kind of a clarification point. Oh, just because, again, I think sometimes, I don't want to assume that everyone has the same level of knowledge in terms of how Capital Bikeshare operates. So yeah, DDOT, has the contract, or Motivate has the contract with DDOT for operations. So Motivate, which is based out of New York, was formerly Alta. They're the operations folks. There are other folks that do work with DDOT and contract in terms of doing promotions and what's the word I'm looking for? And marketing, like Go DC Go. There are other parts of it that get kind of parsed out. So essentially a lot of what goes on sort of under the umbrella of Capital Bikeshare happens multiple places by multiple people that don't necessarily see each other. Especially as operations staff, we're not in on meetings on anything obviously related to, say, the promotion of the system, because it happens somewhere else. And so it's an interesting dynamic in terms of how a system can sort of function with all these different moving parts when people don't actually see each other. Now, clearly there are people on the upper level that are seeing each other, but it's not like a company where, if I, even as a sort of, basic just, operations worker, if I had a question about something, it's not like I can just go to the 5th floor and talk to someone about something. They're a different subcontractor, and I might be crossing some kind of weird line if I go talk to someone that's outside of my own department or outside of my own sort of frame of reference. And that's just, I guess I can speak, that's my personal experience as a worker, not necessarily something I've pulled the rest of the sort of operations staff on. But it is an interesting dynamic where there is sort of a disconnect between operations staff, other folks that are doing other parts of it, DDOT, yeah.
When you talk about raising the fares for, or the fees for bike share, is that something that the DC government sets those rates and they tell bike share this is what you can charge, or does bike share sort of independently decide what the rates are going to be?
Yeah, I think that's it. I believe
That's a fact. The DDOT and the other governing jurisdictions set those rates, and they tell Motivate this is what you're going to charge.
Something I got to add, Mike brings up on the question of the money, the fare box recovery. If we hadn't have been there today in the room, and almost everybody had left besides us, because this was the streetcar portion of the DDOT hearing today, that I think the streetcar has become such a fiasco that the council members figured that they'll just talk about it a lot. Then be able to say that they were on top of it. But it apparently dawned on DDOT that there's no way they're going to be able to charge a fare for the 8th Street subway, or the 8th Street trolley, because there's 2 doors. Not everybody's going to get on the front door. There's the back door where people will get on the front and back, or at least that may be likely to get on if people sneak on. And it isn't going to be like some places if you travel where it's crowded and you give your nickel to the person in front of you and everybody passes it up. If you've never seen that, it's a nice system that works in places where things like that work. But they were literally having to have a discussion about whether they were going to hire fare enforcement officers. And then you start thinking, well, this is okay, that's another job and another person, and what a glorious job that'll be. And this thing's only 2 miles long. And you think,
Goes nowhere.
you're going to have the fare box police to make sure everybody gets on the front. I don't think it was a flex. So anyway, don't let them lecture you about fare box. Because it does sound like on 8th Street, that's gonna be a free ride for a long time because they never thought that piece through apparently, so.
Wait, hipsters gonna be happy.
I should correct myself. I keep mentioning DDOT as the only agency, but there's DDOT, Montgomery County, Arlington County, City of Alexandria, and they're all sort of contracted together. So I keep saying DDOT over and over again. So my apologies to other jurisdictions which are involved. And in other jurisdictions, it's not always the Department of Transportation that's running the program. So even if I say Department of Transportation, that's not necessarily accurate either. So apologies for that.
So the DDOT sets the rates.
Yeah.
Now, do they then also give Capital Bikeshare a certain amount of money in addition to the fare collection, so that to provide for the operation of the system? Is there like a balance between collecting money in the fare or in the fees and then getting a subsidy from the DC government? I mean, how does it work? It's like, like with the circulator collects a certain amount of money from the fare box, and then the DC government gives it a certain amount of other money, and that's the total amount of money which then circulator spends on salaries and benefits and fuel and all this other sort of stuff and a profit.
So cities do this a bunch of different ways with bike shares, starting with whether or not the city itself owns the infrastructure, which in DC you do. In New York, they don't. Then part two is either there's some relationship between the fare box and whether the company gets it or the city gets it, and then there's often the city will pay a fee for every dock that's out there, and DC is a per dock rate. So as many docks as there are out there, that's what the Motivate is paid, and so the reason it's profitable in DC is because they have a income stream that is unrelated to ridership. It's a per dock. Right?
So,
And then there's also sponsorship money. So
And
it's
then,
not that
right.
it's only public money and fare recovery, it's also sponsorship.
But not in the
Different
case of
amounts
Capital
of
Bikeshare where there's no sponsor. So it's all public money
Right,
or,
it's different.
yeah, fair
so
question.
if you want to talk about the bike share people getting a better wage and benefits and pensions, you're really talking about the DC government putting more money into the pot.
Or Motivate taking less out.
Yeah.
That's not going right.
Making sure that
Whichever way you like.
making sure the money gets through Motivate to the workers.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not, I mean,
Intact.
that sort of middle entity in transit is not uncommon. You know, in the largest transportation system in the country, which is the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in the greater New York area, that entire thing, the MTA, was designed to be the thing that all the politicians could get into a room and yell at, right, which you do here. You suck, you suck, you suck. Oh, look at me, I'm defending transportation. And this body sits in the middle, gets the government money, distributes it, runs the system. All the politicians can yell at it, all the customers can yell at it, the advocacy groups can yell at it, everybody can yell at the guy in the middle, and the government is over here. It's not us, it's that. And that's how they're set.
It's plausible deniability.
Not us, it's
Any last questions? We're coming up towards 8 o'clock, which we're going to try to cut ourselves off a little bit early, so we wouldn't have to be going too late. Any last thoughts? Any last questions from folks?
Like, what's ahead in DC for like some of the groups who are working on issues related in like the next 6 months or so?
We're doing our May 1st
What's the
piece.
plan?
These guys they're bargaining a contract with Motivate.
So, I mean, our plan is that we have a national effort to organize bike share workers across the United States of America. We have 4 cities now. We have people working in San Francisco and some other big, the Chattanooga system has 22 docks and a part-time person, but we're not really gonna organize them. So it's, as systems get to the point where we get some density that's worthwhile, that has thing, but the goal is, in my reading of it, if we raise the level of benefits and the security of the jobs, and people like Elliot and Farr and Ursula and those can commit and make a career, make a long-term commitment to bike share as a worker, that's going to stabilize and make the infrastructure of the system better and more robust throughout, and also give a place from which workers can work politically to sort of address some of the issues of putting bike share out that have been plaguing it, and we're sort of on that road. And so we, for example, have a pretty serious effort here in DC with the TWU National to work to change the way the Transportation Act looks at bike share, which currently is really ridiculous, but you can get federal money for the dock when you start a system, but you can't get it for the bike, because the bike is considered a single occupancy vehicle and contributes to air pollution and congestion. Single occupancy vehicles do. I point out that it's two wheels, it doesn't have a motor, it doesn't seem to matter on the regulation. So one of the goals is to shift the national conversation about bike share to it as transit, which will trickle.
One small thing that I know that's happening in DC, and I don't know exactly the timing or exactly what it looks like, is but the Better Bike Share partnership that my work is under the umbrella of, basically People for Bikes, the national organization, the money that they got is essentially to redistribute to other cities, and I know that DDOT got like a $25,000 grant, small grant to do, to essentially, I believe, like sort of try to replicate the partnership that Capital Bikeshare has with Back on My Feet, the homeless services organization, with other social service organizations, to see, a very on the ground, like not a big systemic change, more of like a marketing question and an outreach question, but has a very real potential to affect people's lives in a positive way. So that's one small specific thing that I know that is in the pipeline for Capital Bikeshare in DC.
And if there's anyone in the crowd who's looking for an internship or a job, I think DDOT is actually hiring someone for like a $500 stipend a month to do a lot of kind of what you were talking about in terms of neighborhood outreach and dock and station placement in certain neighborhoods and underserved neighborhoods. So
That was actually my next question is, do you make the decision or does DDOT make the decision about where the docks go? Because I actually live in Anacostia. I have a place in PG, which I see are both underserved. And how would I get involved?
Is DDOT from what, because we've had that discussion come up at the warehouse, the city determines, from what we were told, they determine where the docking stations are. It came up because some of the stations are in very precarious and dangerous intersections. And we've talked to them about it, and supposedly we're gonna go out with them or something and review where they are, but it's supposedly the city that makes the decision.
Add to that and answer the other question. On the Uber accessible taxi front, just so you know, there's a taxi commission accessibility advisory committee that's been operating for a couple of years now, and we have to put out a report every year, so we'll be doing that again. Last December, there was a bill that would have required, one of the things that would have done would have required Uber to pay into an accessibility fund, basically for not providing accessible services, so that folks who did want to drive an accessible taxi or an accessible Uber car could go to the city and get some funds to do that. So we're not the taxi commission committee, because I can't do that with them, but advocates are going to be really pushing for Che to reintroduce that bill, because she pulled it in December. So we hope she will do that again, or she will reintroduce it. We really hope she will. So that's on that front. And to get the city council and DDOT basically change the culture and to get people to think about, like, if you're going to operate in the city, if you're not going to provide accessible service, you better help us find a way to do it to make sure that people do have access, and without creating a two-tier system. So folks know, just because we mentioned safety, Councilmember Che created a bicycle pedestrian safety working group. And we had a first meeting sometime this month, I forget, and there's going to be a series of meetings, I think, in May and possibly June, and it may go on longer than that to make recommendations, because of the bicycle safety bill that she introduced. I think it didn't go well, and they realized there were a lot of questions outstanding. So that's kind of a big room. I got invited. If there are safety concerns around bike share, I would really love to know them, so And then just for people to be aware, so on the legislative front again, last year, Che also introduced the Transit or Transportation Reorganization Act. There are a whole series of meetings that some of you may have been in. It didn't pass, but what it looks like is Mayor Bowser has said, give me a chance to try to fix DDOT and the Taxi Commission before you reintroduce this bill. That's what I think is happening. And so there's all these little changes happening in both of those agencies. And so I think in the next 6 months, it's really important to look at DDOT and see how they're trying to change. And because part of the TRA was to really increase accountability and transparency. So it's a really great time to push them on it and to push the mayor on it and say, this is the time. But you said you want a fresh start, you want all these new things. Like, let's be transparent, let's be accountable. So.
I think that's a really good place to end. Let's put our hands together, round of applause for our panelists. And I'm sure folks will kind of stick around if folks want to come up and ask questions. If you have any thoughts, please write them on the board up there. There's a sign-in sheet, there's flyers over there. FAR's got a very interesting flyer about Motivate and the parent company and their sort of take on urban development if you're interested in that sort of thing. So thank you all very much for coming out, and hopefully we'll do this again. Thank you.